Just a little overview about the scorecard on Indigenous or business practices. Are you running a Western, um, business, or are you running the business or your operations from Indigenous perspective? That's $1 million question, which we're trying to create more awareness around, and some little tools to help you on your journey, whether that's reconciliation journey, just personal interests of Indigenous perspectives, or even Aboriginal entrepreneurs that want to try and decolonize their mindset, and try and operate from more of a community perspective than the individualist perspective, which is generally what Western societies are based on. So this is a quick look of the scorecard. If you go to click the URL, go to the website, check it out. Only take less than 2 minutes. I think the average is 1.5 minutes of completion. It's very quick. 13 questions, and all you need to do is choose the one that resonates best with you. Don't try and think too deeply about it. Just nice and quick, and at the end of it, you'll get a scorecard, or a barometer, and so you can see where your mindset's at, and whether it's operating from an Indigenous perspective, more community-based, humble perspective, compared to Western, which is very individualized, and generally speaking very egotistic, ego-driven. Go check it out, and let us know what you think too. This is a first version, so it won't be perfect like anything from the get-go. Version 1 is usually not perfect. So let us know what you think, any feedback, any potential questions you want to see in these surveys or assessment tools. And if you've got any other can't speak properly at the moment, need another coffee, any other ideas about potential assessment tools. We mainly focus on Indigenous entrepreneurship because that's kind of my thing, but just let us know what you think. Open to suggestions. So the reason why I harp on and about Indigenous entrepreneurship and the differences between Indigenous versus Western is because there's a lot of stuff happening, and unfortunately there's not a lot of good stuff happening actually on a grassroots level in communities. A lot of talk and little action in relation to Indigenous rights and closing the disparity gaps. And as you've probably seen, the Indigenous procurement policy and all that kind of stuff, lots of talk, but lots of roadblocks, and what I like to call the middleman in between, usually non-Indigenous organizations, getting their share of the Indigenous procurement and that kind of stuff, but very little of it actually making its way into the grassroots level for Indigenous people, and actually making a difference to combat poverty and all the negatives from colonisation of Indigenous people in Australia. And you see the government harp on about it a lot in relation to the Indigenous procurement policy. Big numbers. We're giving this much away to Indigenous businesses, but again, you hardly see that making a positive impact in community on a grassroots level. I'm sure a few Indigenous people are getting rich out of it, which is cool. No hate towards them, but these procurement policies, these are social procurement policies, and are supposed to make a difference in community, not make a few people rich. If people want to get rich, just have a crack at it, just normally. There's no reason to go down to the Indigenous procurement route. Western economies are generally built on open markets. So, if you're that good, you shouldn't need to do these, dodgy joint ventures and that kind of stuff. If you're a hardcore entrepreneur, then don't go down the procurement policy. Just compete in the open market. which brings us, yeah, there's a lot of examples out there. A lot of grassroots community members are starting to speak out more so about some of the problems with what is an Indigenous business and these joint ventures, which are winning these big contracts when the government says it's given billions of dollars away. And it looks impressive on the surface, and they even include we helped thousands of Indigenous businesses. But once you actually dig a bit deeper, you see that these $1 billion contracts, 80% of it, majority of these $1 billion is actually gone to a half a dozen businesses, which are most of the time are joint ventures, and I don't think much of that is making its way back into community, and a lot of big multinational non-Indigenous organizations are getting rich out of it. But these joint ventures and black cladding, is having a negative impact on the whole thing. Especially, people say, "Oh, $1 billion, billions of dollars gone to Indigenous businesses." It's like, are they really, Indigenous businesses? And that's the multi-billion-dollar, million-dollar question. So, what is an Indigenous business? There's a lot of talk around. No, Indigenous business it's not 50%. It has to be 51% because technically have ownership of the business. But as we'll get into, just because you have majority ownership of the business doesn't mean the benefits of the actual business, go to the Indigenous partner or back into the Indigenous community per se. And there's a few other people saying 51% isn't working, which it isn't. How do we support 100% Indigenous owned businesses? But for me, it's basically they're talking about the same thing, whether it's 51%, 100%, 99%. It doesn't really matter because you can have these corporations and and the church in the middle. I was looking for something to show like a company, and I couldn't find a good symbol graph for it, and I just came across the church and thought that could work too, since churches kind of haven't been really supportive of Indigenous people and we're kind of the cause of the Indigenous colonization across the world. So we'll put the church in there. The church represents Indigenous, quote unquote Indigenous business company structure. So you got the Indigenous procurement policy. They pump out all this money to these businesses and quote unquote Indigenous businesses, these joint ventures that win 80-90% of these $1 billion contracts, and the actual benefits, whether it's 51% or actually 100%, it doesn't mean it flows into Indigenous communities, or into the Indigenous business partner per se, because you have these agreements and that kind of stuff. And at the end of the day, this Indigenous business could just be a shell company. Could be Indigenous face represents it, but the money and actual benefits is actually going back into the non-Indigenous organization and partners. So that's why I'm a bit iffy with this, question around ownership. Like obviously it has to be, Indigenous owned. But you just create these shell companies anyways, and the benefits just go to the non-Indigenous organizational partners anyway. So, what's really the point when you spend these billions of dollars supposedly helping Indigenous businesses, but are they really Indigenous business? Because what we've got out of it, out of this social procurement policy, is that a few people got rich, and congrats to them. But grassroots community helping close the disparity gap, it hasn't helped anything. There's still a lot of people, homeless, living in poverty, and that kind of stuff. The lower median wages and income per household than non-Indigenous people. There's massive gaps there, and nothing's happening. It's the same old story, whether it's Liberals or Labor. It just they have these nice policies that sound good on paper, but um, what are they actually doing to create better communities? Because it's not making a difference. It hasn't made a difference, and it still isn't. So that's why I think there needs to be why I created the scorecard on Indigenous business practice. This little assessment tool quiz, just to give you a little snapshot on where you're operating from an Indigenous or Western perspective, based on a dozen questions. But I feel an Indigenous business has to be obviously Indigenous owned. Um, for me, it doesn't matter if it's 10% or 100% or 51%. The percentage doesn't matter, as long as it's Indigenous owned, Indigenous controlled, and more importantly, operating from Indigenous entrepreneurship perspective. It's benefiting community. It's having a positive impact. It's not making a few non-Indigenous people rich. So that's a big missing piece at the moment with the Indigenous procurement policy and this quote unquote, what is an Indigenous business? And for me, it's a piece of, are you operating from an Indigenous perspective, which is community orientated, and instead of just getting rich, because it's okay, just getting rich, nothing wrong with capitalism. I'm not a communist or anything like that. But if we're talking about Indigenous business, Indigenous entrepreneurship, it's totally different from, Western entrepreneurship, even social entrepreneurship. It's a different way of doing things. And, if the government wants to actually have an impact, or big corporations want to actually help, which I question, they obviously have to just start doing things differently. And coming from an Indigenous perspective, an Indigenous approach to solving the solution, which they haven't done before, could deliver those results. So obviously, it has to be Indigenous owned to be an Indigenous business, but it also has to be operating from an Indigenous entrepreneurship perspective, to get it tick in the box, to be an Indigenous business. And again, like, if you're Indigenous and you want to make it in the open market, that's cool. There's nothing wrong with that. But once you start going into like Indigenous procurement policy and that space, social procurement contracts, then you should be, in my opinion, operating from an Indigenous perspective. You should be running an Indigenous business. Otherwise, just do things like 99% or 97% of other Australians do. Just compete on the open market. There's nothing wrong with that. So that's why, created the scorecard, little assessment quiz, to see if you're operating from Indigenous or Western perspective. Again, let us know feedback, any questions. It's the first version, so try not to be too hard on me. Also, just recording this through the presentation. I know a few people are like, Dean, you need to show your face. I want to see your face. I prefer to to be behind the scenes, but yeah, maybe next time, you can see my face and put a put a face to everything, and might make it the presentation a bit more engaging. But yeah, just want to create this little event, promote the little scorecard we created, and just slowly build around awareness around what is an Indigenous business, because Indigenous business at the moment, whether it's 50%, 51%, 100%, it's not working in relation to the Indigenous procurement policy. Most of it seems to be still benefiting non-Indigenous organizations, non-Indigenous people, because if you go into communities, the gaps are still there, disparity gaps are still there, nothing's changing despite these billion-dollar contracts. So something needs to change. So just trying to help where we can. Let us know feedback, comments, and stay connected.